I'd just like to thank you both for such energetic presentations at the end of a very full 2 days, but also for doing such close readings of the two objects that sat at the heart of your papers, the kind of objects that don't often get close readings. So that you really helped us, I think, expand our understanding of the central theme of the 2-day symposium, which is the Australian object, by introducing new kind of object types that allow us to expand some of the thinking that has happened over the last 2 days. I'm sure there are many questions. I can see hands immediately shooting into the air. So I'm just going to sit back and let things unfold, but I see a microphone now moving across. We have our first question.
Yeah, thank you both for your terrific papers. My question is really to Anita, but if I may, I'd just like to make a comment before putting the question. And it is to do with George Edwards and Nell Sterling. You know, you were talking in large measure about radio programs and the ephemera of that and the difficulty of knowing exactly how they sounded and what they said. But there is a very tangible story connected to those two. And it also ties in with the light shows and the magic of light that we've kind of been addressing a little bit in this conference. Sam Nipsom designed an apartment for them. And the reason we know most about Darjoa, the name of their apartment, which was taken from their radio names, Darlie and Joan, I think, or something, is a wonderful a series of photographs by Max Dupayne, where he uses very strong, very powerful diagonal shafts of lighting to create the sort of spatial dramas that he wanted. And it's one of the first architectural photos that he actually takes, and he becomes then very well known for his architecture. So it's those two who made their money by all these things, were able to commission a leading contemporary architect, and then that was photographed by Max Dupayne. My question is, I take your, accept your argument about the comic, the book series, the Taconian Peggy series, as being generated in part by the war and the need to recognise our interdependency here within Australia to support each other and learn something from Aboriginal people. But at the same time, is it the case that all of that was inspired by the publication just a few years earlier by Inky P.R. Stevenson on Foundations of Australian Culture? Do you know if there's a connection between those series and the book, because it was very widely discussed in the 1936 it came out, Foundations of Australian Culture, where basically Stevenson is arguing against the colonial representation of Australia, Mother England and all of that, begging Australians to stand on their own 2 feet and to see what is distinctive about their culture. And the frontispiece to that book has an Aboriginal community, I mean, of a person holding a shield or something. It's corny and cliched, but it's, and the Jindawarra movement grows out of that. So I'm just wondering whether there's a link between those kinds of discourses in the latter part of the 1930s and what you were talking about today.
Let me think about that for a minute, and is this working? Yes. And answer your first comment. Yes, I'm well aware, thank you, for the photographs by Dupin of the Point Piper House. And they are really stunning images. And just to let everyone else know that George and Nell actually did a radio program every morning called Darby and Joan, and they would sit and pretend to read the newspapers over the radio and have gossipy programs, gossipy whatever. So they, as Catherine's pointed out, that they called their house, was it Darjoa? Yeah. And there's another wonderful connection too, because post-Nell Sterling, after they were divorced, George Edwards married Coral Lansbury, who is actually Malcolm Turnbull's mother. So there we are. To get back to more serious stuff, I think there was looking through a whole raft of objects and books produced during that wartime period. There are a number of books which honestly I've only just really discovered, and I haven't mentioned them at all, that they're all seeming to do the same thing. I can't really believe that these sort of writers and artists were really and truly, I mean, they're not high artists of high culture. I can't believe that they were really influenced by wonderful, good, kindly feelings at all. I feel that there was no doubt some sort of government incentive to draw attention to the fact that things are going very badly and we need to change our attention to what is going on in the Northern Territory. And I think rather than basing it on altruistic motives, I think there was something really rather, I don't know, what's a word? Anyone can think of a word. Obviously the cough's got rid of my brain cells as well. I mean, you know, there was really some sort of self-interest involved. But, you know, I take your point, and giving a short paper and just making smart remarks like that, you know, isn't appropriate for any sort of published paper, and it really needs looking into very closely.
Hi, I should preface this by saying I was speaking out of the trauma of a Queensland-adjacent childhood, so I do apologise for that. I was reminded in your talk, Priya, of Queensland's legacy of having residual icons post-event. And I was trying to remember where the 1982 Commonwealth Games kangaroo ended up. And it ended up out the front of Wet and Wild, which is great. And I think in, you know, the pantheon of abandoned things like Stephen's Space Needle, the Commonwealth kangaroo, and these signs in Caboolture, they have a very strange afterlife, these kinds of objects.
Just to cut in, like Expo 88, it's fascinating because I think it had celebrations, the 1 year anniversary, the 5 year, the 10, 20, the 30. It's reported to be, you know, the most memorialised World Expo globally. It's fascinating, and you, as a Queenslander, might be able to tell me why.
I did say Queensland adjacent, just
Queensland adjacent, sorry.
Particular about that language, sorry, trauma. What's really interesting though is that, yeah, they can be rehabilitated into some kind of nostalgic narrative, but they also represent some kind of residue around, I know that the Expo 88 ushered in the beginnings of gentrification to the West End, the evacuation of a lot of Indigenous inhabitants from West End. Evacuation is very kind. Do you think in the mix of nostalgia attached to these objects, there's also this sense of something left undone, a residue to be worked through?
I think that's a really interesting observation, and you're so right that what I didn't get to talk about is that, you know, in making the space for Expo 88, Aboriginal people and others, mostly relatively new migrants, were kind of unceremoniously removed from the space that it was put up in. And then as someone like Fiona Foley has observed and written, you know, the South Bank, which was developed in Expo's place, has a kind of amazing erasure of Aboriginal cultures from Queensland. There isn't really a presence for them, or hasn't been, you know, for the longest time. So there's an interesting, I think you're really right, a really interesting kind of tension of remembering and maybe forgetting that's embodied in these signs. Yeah, that's something I really only just started thinking about them, and it's something I definitely would like to pursue, so thank you.
You guys gave fantastic papers. Thank you so much. They were completely brilliant and opened up this new question about commercial imperatives in objects. And I just wondered whether you had anything to say about the fact that these objects are not only kind of interesting for their social and cultural meanings, you know, that they have at the time and then acquire later on, but also for the way that they're deliberately appealing to a particular market.
Everybody.
So, yes, that's right. And in Priya, in your sign, you can see the logo. I think it's the bicentenary logo in, I can't remember which letter it is. And, so anyway, that's my question. It's not really much of a question, but how do you incorporate the commercial imperatives of these objects into their interpretation?
I don't think I can answer that one either.
Sorry.
I think in a really straightforward sense, we have to understand the Australia signs as selling the Australian Pavilion in Expo 88. That's what they were commissioned for. There's certainly art that celebrates that, but they were placed at the entrance strategically to draw people in and attract them, and apparently that is exactly what they did. So I think they are, in a really straightforward sense, in a way, an advertisement. But then it's interesting to think about their afterlife now at the Caboolture Heritage Village, where they become a point of attraction and tourism and another selling point for them as well. And I think those connections between commerce and heritage are actually not just for signs like things like this, but fine art is deployed all the time to bring people to places, and I'm thinking of the Mona Lisa in the Louvre. So for me, it's, I guess, part of a continuation of the sometimes uncomfortable relationship between art and commerce, certainly.
Priya, there seems to be such a connection between passing of the microphones. There seemed to be such a connection between the actual advertisements that you showed us and the sign, in terms of the way that there is a kind of a quickness to their pace, so that there's continual sort of cutting away, and that I like the way that you showed the individual letters in the one of the last slides that you have, so that the way that they're so visually dynamic and slightly different from one another, you move across the letters very quickly, and also in the way that they suggest some kind of action or like sensory experience, like the S is turned into a wave, so that it's not just sort of the visual culture of Australia, but it extends beyond it, so that you can experience the thing that you go to Queensland for, like to swim in the ocean, like the ad for Queensland showed us. So it's sort of activated in that way.
That's such a really good point, absolutely. And I guess activated, and then, there's great photos online of people sitting on the letters, and so it's activated and in their action as well. Great point, thanks, Mark.
I was just going to make a remark about the commercialisation of the search for the golden boomerang. As I think I mentioned, the whole of the George Edwards Players routine was, I think there was writer Maurice Francis until he joined the army, and Sumner Lock Elliott stepped in after that, and Laura Bingham. But it was a commercial thing. It wasn't an art enterprise. I don't really believe that they thought deeply about how wonderful drama or theatre or anything else was. The books themselves were sponsored and sold by department store Snow's in Sydney and some other department store in Melbourne. And each one of the books has an advertisement for Hoadley's chocolate bar on the back, and I don't know whether anyone noticed it. Peggy and Taccone find the greatest treasure of it all, which is a Hoadley's. And each book, as it progresses through, the whole set of 5 or 6 of them, have a developing Hoadley's advertisement on the back, where Hoadley's violet crumble bars are delivered to soldiers dying on the war front, being dropped from aeroplanes into the jungles of New Guinea during the war, and so on. And the whole thing is really, really very tacky, because you can feel this sort of commercial edge to the whole thing. And perhaps this is a very long time project of mine that I started and I just couldn't handle. And the only reason I've resurrected it now was that I was asked to present something here, and I don't do material culture. I don't start with an object really, and I was tearing out my hair thinking, what should I do? And I realised, and this is so wonderful of View 3 for inviting me, and I've realised the connection between the object and the ideas and so on behind, and it's just sort of helped me not only in this study but in a lot of the rest of my thinking, so thank you very much.
And I can imagine, Anita, it's quite difficult to work with some of this material, particularly considering that there are substantial writers who are producing some of it. So someone like Eliot, I mean, many people may know his novels, and I think that some of them have been made into films, but that he was a sort of a deeply kind of reflective, critical writer in some regards, but obviously not all of the time.
No. However, I don't think he regarded this sort of work as his high ambition, but it was bread and butter. And later he makes comments about how terrible it all was and how mean George Edwards and Nell apparently was the mean one, but how little money they made and how hard they worked and so on. So it was a commercial enterprise. It wasn't really an artistic, cultural enterprise at all, alas. But I think we're still allowed to deal with the products, of their arrangement.
I'm so sorry. I know we could continue on into to the evening, but we have places to go and things to do. And please join me in thanking this last exhilarating panel.